When you hear the names Tecumseh, Geronimo, or Sitting Bull, what flashes into your mind? For most people, it's the Hollywood image, the lone warrior on horseback, rifle in hand, silhouetted against the sunset, fighting a battle he knows he cannot win. It's the image of the last stand, the tragic but noble defeat, the end of a way of life. But what if that image was never the truth? What if these leaders were not simply doomed warriors clinging to the past, but visionaries, strategists, and even nation-builders who posed such a serious challenge to the United States that their real stories had to be buried beneath myth? Tonight, we're going to peel back the layers of legend and propaganda. We'll uncover the real strategies of Tecumseh, Geronimo, and Sitting Bull, their diplomacy, their guerrilla tactics, their spiritual leadership, and ask a simple but dangerous question. Was conquest really inevitable, or has history been rewritten to make us believe it was? The myth of the doomed warrior is one of the most enduring in American culture. It shows up in old Western films, in children's textbooks, and even in the way we casually talk about history. In this story, Native Americans are always already defeated. They appear as noble figures who resist bravely but pointlessly against the unstoppable tide of progress. The story ends the same way every time. The last battle, the tragic fall, the noble death. It's a narrative designed not to honor Native peoples, but to comfort everyone else. Because if resistance was always doomed, then what happened on this continent? The taking of land, the breaking of treaties, the destruction of nations becomes something inevitable. Destiny. Manifest destiny. The phrase itself was crafted to make conquest sound not only natural, but righteous. But this narrative erases the truth. The United States was not some unstoppable force rolling across the land. Every mile of its expansion was contested. Every treaty signed was fraught with resistance. Every war fought was costly. And the leaders who resisted were not simply warriors. They were sophisticated strategists. They thought in terms of alliances, diplomacy, religion, and psychology as much as they thought in terms of battles. Tecumseh, Geronimo, Sitting Bull, these men are often remembered only for their defeats. But to focus only on their end is to miss the brilliance of what they built, the alternatives they offered, and the very real moments when the future of North America hung in the balance. Tecumseh's vision may be one of the most ambitious in Native history and one of the greatest threats ever posed to American expansion. Born in 1768 among the Shawnee, Tecumseh's childhood was scarred by violence. His father was killed by settlers, and his people were pushed further and further west. He grew up watching tribe after tribe forced into treaties that ceded land, treaties signed under duress, often with no real choice. Tecumseh understood something crucial. Divided, the tribes of North America could not withstand the flood of settlers, but united, they might. His solution was radical. Land was not property. It was a sacred inheritance shared by all Native peoples. Therefore, no single tribe had the right to sell land without the consent of all. This idea became the foundation of a pan-Indian confederacy. Tecumseh became a tireless traveler and orator. He went north to the Great Lakes, west into the plains, and south to the Creek and Choctaw, speaking with leaders everywhere he went. His speeches, described even by enemies as electrifying, carried a simple but powerful message. Together, they could resist. Divided, they would be destroyed. Tecumseh wasn't just building a military alliance. He was trying to reimagine Native sovereignty on a continental scale. During the War of 1812, Tecumseh allied with the British, not because he loved the empire, but because he saw them as a counterweight to the United States. And for a brief time, it worked. His confederacy terrified American leaders. William Henry Harrison, the future president, wrote that as long as Tecumseh lived, the frontier would never be safe. But Tecumseh's dream was fragile. After his death in 1813 at the Battle of the Thames, the Confederacy collapsed. Yet his vision of pan-Indian unity lived on. He showed that resistance could be more than local. It could be continental. He forced Americans to confront a terrifying possibility, that their expansion might be stopped not by war, but by unity. Where Tecumseh sought unity through diplomacy, Geronimo embodied the art of survival through mobility and cunning. Born in 1829 into the Chiricahua Apache, Geronimo came of age in a landscape as harsh as it was beautiful, the deserts and mountains of the Southwest. To outsiders, these lands looked barren, uninhabitable. To Geronimo, they were the perfect battleground. His life was marked by trauma. When Mexican soldiers killed his family, Geronimo swore revenge, and for the rest of his life, he became a figure who haunted both Mexican and American forces. Hollywood casts him as a defiant outlaw, but the reality is far more complex. Geronimo was a master of guerrilla warfare, long before the term was widely known. His bands were small, fast, and impossible to pin down. They struck suddenly, vanished into the terrain, and reappeared miles away. The U.S. Army, with thousands of soldiers, struggled for years to capture him. Campaign after campaign ended in frustration. Soldiers would march for weeks in the desert heat, chasing shadows, only to find themselves ambushed, their supply lines cut, their morale broken. And then there was the psychological side. Geronimo's name became legend. Settlers whispered that he could appear anywhere, that he had supernatural powers, that he could not be killed. The fear of Geronimo often did as much damage as his actual raids. But here's the part Hollywood ignores. Geronimo was not simply fighting for glory. He negotiated, made peace when it seemed possible, surrendered when it meant saving his people, then returned to resistance when treaties were broken. He was pragmatic, not reckless. His goal was always survival, not some doomed stand. In the end, Geronimo's long resistance forced the United States to commit massive resources to subduing a few hundred Apaches. That fact alone reveals his brilliance. He showed that even the most powerful armies could be humbled by small groups with the right strategy, the right terrain, and the right leader. Sitting Bull, born in 1831 among the Hunkpapa Lakota, is remembered above all for one moment, the defeat of George Armstrong Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. But to reduce him to this single victory is to miss the depth of his leadership. Sitting Bull was not primarily a war chief. He was a spiritual leader, a man whose authority came from visions, wisdom, and his ability to inspire unity. In the months before Little Bighorn, he had a vision, soldiers falling into camp like grasshoppers. This vision spread among his people, giving them confidence that victory was possible. It united Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho into one of the largest gatherings of native warriors ever seen. The battle itself was shocking, a total rout of Custer's men. For a moment, Sitting Bull and his allies had delivered the United States one of its most stunning defeats. But Sitting Bull's brilliance wasn't just in that victory. He knew that no single battle, no matter how decisive, could stop the U.S. He led his people into exile in Canada, seeking safety, and later negotiated with U.S. authorities. He adapted when forced onto reservations, continuing to lead in ways that were as much symbolic as practical. When he joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, some saw it as surrender. But it was also a strategy, a way to earn resources for his people, a way to travel the world, a way to remind audiences that native nations were still alive. Sitting Bull was murdered in 1890, but by then his name had become a symbol not only of resistance, but of dignity, vision, and endurance. Hollywood wants us to see him only as the man who killed Custer. But in truth, he was a leader whose power was in his ability to inspire, to unite, and to envision a different world. Now, let's step back and ask, why do the stories we hear look so different from the reality? Why are Tecumseh, Geronimo, and Sitting Bull remembered as doomed warriors rather than as strategists, diplomats, and visionaries? The answer is simple. The myth serves the conqueror. If native resistance is remembered only as noble but futile, then the conquest of America looks inevitable. It becomes the natural order of history, the unfolding of destiny. But if the truth is told, if we remember Tecumseh nearly uniting half the continent, Geronimo humiliating the U.S. Army, Sitting Bull inspiring nations, and defeating Custer, then we see that conquest was never certain. Every step was contested. Every treaty was resisted. Every so-called victory came at enormous cost. The truth undermines the myth of manifest destiny. It shows us that the United States wasn't destined to expand. It chose to expand through war, deception, and overwhelming force. And it reveals something even more dangerous, that other futures were possible. Futures in which native nations survived as sovereign powers, in which the continent became a shared space rather than a conquered one. Hollywood erases those futures because to remember them is to question the story America tells about itself. The legacies of Tecumseh, Geronimo, and Sitting Bull did not die with them. Tecumseh's dream of pan-Indian unity continues to echo in modern indigenous politics. Organizations and alliances today, fighting for treaty rights, for sovereignty, for recognition, carry forward the same idea, that unity creates power. Geronimo's tactics, his ability to use terrain, mobility, and psychology are studied in military academies worldwide. He proved that small groups can humble empires, a lesson repeated in countless guerrilla wars since. Sitting Bull's vision. That leadership can be spiritual as well as military, symbolic as well as practical, remains an inspiration for indigenous activists and leaders who continue to resist erasure not only through protest, but through cultural revival, ceremony, and storytelling. These men were not relics of a dying world. They were innovators. They adapted. They resisted. They envisioned alternatives. Their stories remind us that history is not a straight line. It is full of crossroads, choices, and possibilities. And sometimes, those possibilities are buried under myths because they are too dangerous to remember. So, what do we make of this? Were Tecumseh, Geronimo, and Sitting Bull tragic figures destined to lose, or were they visionaries who nearly changed the course of history? If Tecumseh had lived longer, could his confederacy have endured? If Geronimo had been able to hold out just a little longer, could the U.S. have been forced into a lasting treaty? If Sitting Bull's vision had been heeded, could native nations have retained sovereignty into the modern era? These questions are uncomfortable because they remind us that conquest was not destiny. It was a series of choices, and those choices had alternatives. Hollywood wants us to forget that, to believe the end was written from the beginning. But the truth is, Nothing was inevitable. These leaders prove it. What did you think about today's video? Were you surprised by how different the reality is from the myth? Share your thoughts and suggestions for my next video in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think.